Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can get any updates to our forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. You can also call our weather info line at 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast through that means as well. And also you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. Starting off, we'll take a look at the warnings that we do have out for the area. Down in the Deltona and Tanana Flats area, as well as the eastern Alaska range, we do have out some red flag warnings. Those are in effect until 10 p.m. this evening, so on Wednesday evening. And then we also have a wind advisory that is out until 10 p.m. this evening. That is for the eastern Alaska range from areas that are north of Donnelly Dome. Those winds could get up to as high as 50 miles per hour. Be mindful, especially in the passes. Looking ahead, we can also see that we do have some rainfall coming into the Panhandle area. Going to get pretty high for some of the locations, especially in the southern areas, up to as high as 2 to 3 inches for Ketchikan. And that's going to be late tonight, so Wednesday night through Thursday night. Again, that's going to be some heavy rainfall for areas, especially in the southern portions of the Panhandle, up to as high as 2 to 3 inches in some locations. Looking out at our fire danger, we'll start up north in the Yukon Flats area. We do have some high danger up there, some high danger in central portions of the interior, down into areas around McGrath, as well as down into places of southwest Alaska, down into the Bristol Bay area where we are seeing some areas of extreme. Then we do have some areas around the Anchorage Bowl area up into the Matanuska and Susitna valleys, and then up in the Copper River Basin as well, some high fire danger. Taking a look at our satellite imagery, we'll see one low anchored out by the Alaska Peninsula, bringing cloud cover and rain to areas around southwest Alaska and the peninsula itself and some areas of the Bering Sea. If we look a little bit further to the east, moving through the Gulf of Alaska, we can see the old frontal boundary pushing in through places of the Gulf, extending out towards the Panhandle area. And watching one more time, we'll watch a system coming up from the North Pacific, headed out towards the Gulf as well, moving in towards the Panhandle. That's going to be one of the factors in bringing the heavy rain to the Panhandle area moving into tomorrow. And then as we look out over mainland Alaska, some clearing for much of the interior, but we can already see some of the afternoon convection developing, bringing some of those showers and potential for thunderstorms to the area. So looking out for the remainder of today, we'll start up in the interior where we do have low pressure lingering there, allowing for that instability and convection to develop, with the possibility for those thunderstorms in these afternoon and evening hours for places of the central and eastern interior, as well as up in the eastern portions of the Brooks Range. Some isolated showers up along the Arctic coastline. Moving down to southwest Alaska, going to see showers from that low that's anchored out over the Alaska Peninsula, continuing to bring rain to the Kodiak Island and eastern Aleutian Islands as well. Out to the west, out over much of the Bering Sea, and then the central and western Aleutians, we have areas of fog underneath high pressure out over the area. And then we do have that old boundary moving through the Gulf that's bringing rain to the rest of the North Gulf Coast, pushing into some places of South Central as well, and throughout much of the Panhandle with that second system coming up. As we move into tonight, we'll see that system approaching the Alaska Panhandle more, bringing more rain with that southerly flow to the area, starting to bring some of that heavier precip, especially as we get later into the tonight period. Then as we look along North Gulf Coast, continuing to see rain there with some isolated showers through much of South Central, and our low pressure continuing to linger out over the Alaska Peninsula, bringing more rain to the peninsula, Kodiak Island, and the eastern Aleutians, with some isolated showers making it into southwest Alaska. Showers will linger in through much of the interior through the night. However, the thunderstorms are expected to diminish quite a bit in the evening hours, and then we'll see fog developing along the Arctic coastline through much of the west coast and St. Lawrence Island, then out over much of the Bering Sea and central and western Aleutians. For Thursday, high pressure going to continue to linger out over the western Aleutian Islands, keeping some low clouds over the area. Our low pressure also continuing to stay out by the Alaska Peninsula, bringing more rain to those locations and to Kodiak Island, then up through much of southwest Alaska. Continuing to see the development of thunderstorms in the afternoon and evening hours on Thursday for central western high interior, and then through much of the southern portions of the Brooks Range. Rain expected along the North Gulf Coast and out over the Panhandle area as that frontal system is pushing into the area, bringing that heavy precipitation, especially to those southern locations. So move into Friday, another system coming up to the Panhandle area, not quite as heavy of rain, but still expected to see continued rain for the Panhandle area. Rain throughout much of the southern portions of the mainland, extending down to the Bristol Bay area, and up through much of the interior where thunderstorms will develop again in the afternoon hours on Friday. Then we'll see some lingering showers for the Alaska Peninsula and the eastern and central Aleutians as that low pressure out over the area finally starts to push to the southeast. For temperatures Thursday morning, starting off in the Panhandle area, dropping down to right around 50 degrees, in the mid-40s for South Central, and in the 50s for much of the interior, extending out to the west coast. Up along the Arctic coastline, dropping down to right around freezing, and for the Aleutian Islands, dropping down to around 40 degrees. For Thursday afternoon highs, seeing temperatures get back up in the mid-40s for the Aleutians, in the 60s for Southwest Alaska, getting up into the 70s as we get into places of the interior, and then dropping back down to only getting up into the 40s along the Arctic coastline. Down in South Central Alaska, getting up into the mid-60s, and then in right around 60 degrees for the Panhandle. Friday morning lows dropping down to right around 50 degrees for the Panhandle, into the mid-40s for South Central Alaska, into the lower 50s for the interior, right around freezing for the Arctic coastline, and into the mid-40s for the Bristol Bay area, and right around 40 degrees for the Aleutians. Friday afternoon highs getting up into the mid-40s for the Aleutians, up to around 60 degrees for Southwest Alaska, into the lower 70s for much of the interior, into the 40s along the Arctic coastline, into the 60s for South Central Alaska, and into the mid to upper 50s for much of the Panhandle area, with the Yakutat getting up to 56 degrees and right around 60 degrees for those southern locations.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Thursday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, widespread IFR conditions are expected. As we move into southern portions of mainland Alaska, we are going to see some MVFR conditions throughout the Bristol Bay area and much of south central Alaska. As we stretch further east through the Gulf of Alaska, we will see some MVFR and IFR conditions for the Panhandle area, with the MVFR conditions further to the north. In interior portions of the state, primarily VFR conditions, until we get along the west coast, where we are expecting to see a mixture of MVFR and IFR conditions, and MVFR conditions expected along most of the north slope. As we move into Thursday afternoon, some MVFR conditions are going to start to creep in on the very western portions of the Arctic coastline. And then as we move down the west coast of this state, going to see a lot of MVFR conditions along the coast, with some IFR conditions just off over the water. Down in the Bering and Aleutian Islands, expecting to see widespread IFR conditions. And we are going to see some MVFR and IFR conditions for areas along the North Gulf Coast, some extending into eastern locations of south central Alaska. And then down in the Panhandle area, widespread IFR conditions are going to move into the area Thursday afternoon. Friday morning, some of those IFR conditions are going to start to pull back to the south and leave MVFR conditions in areas further to the north. However, over south central Alaska, expecting IFR conditions to encompass most of the area. Primarily VFR conditions for the interior are expected Friday morning. But as we move to the west coast, once again, we are going to see some MVFR and IFR conditions along the coastline, with IFR conditions all along the north slope. As we move down to the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, expecting widespread IFR conditions to continue. Those conditions will last into Friday afternoon for the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. However, out over the south central areas of the state, we are expecting the IFR conditions to improve to MVFR conditions, with some of those MVFR conditions extending into southern locations of the interior. Along the west coast, once again, we're going to see some MVFR conditions all the way up the coastline and for much of the western coast of the Arctic coastline as well. Then way down in the Panhandle area, we are expecting to see IFR conditions in the south, but improving to VFR conditions in areas further to the north. For the passes starting up north, and Anaktuvuk Pass is expected to be VFR throughout the day on Thursday, as well as Adigan Pass expected to be VFR throughout the day. Lake Clark and Merrill both start off with marginal conditions and then improve to VFR conditions in the afternoon. Rainy Pass will also start off in VFR, improving to VFR, as well as at Windy Pass. Isabel Pass, another one that's going to be in VFR in the morning, improving to VFR conditions in the afternoon. Mentasta Pass as well in VFR, improving to VFR conditions. Tanita Pass should be VFR throughout the day on Thursday, whereas Portage should be in VFR throughout the day on Thursday. And then Chilkoot and White will both start off in VFR and then drop down to IFR conditions in the afternoon. Looking at our freezing level, surface freezing line off the Arctic coastline with an 8,000 foot height over the Arctic or over the North Slope area, just to the north of the Brooks Range. Another 8,000 foot line moving through the interior, and then getting down to 6,000 feet over south central Alaska and 4,000 feet near Kodiak Island. If we look at our icing, expecting icing to be near the low that's out by the Alaska Peninsula, extending areas above 8,000 feet over Kodiak Island, the Alaska Peninsula, and the Bristol Bay area. As we look at our jet stream, starting off up north, we do have some weaker areas of winds that are starting to make their way around 50 knots out of a southwesterly direction over the northeastern portions of the state. Down over the Panhandle area, southerly winds around 70 knots. Southeasterly winds moving through the Barrens area and out over southwest Alaska, around 70 knots there. And then northerly winds out over the eastern Aleutians, around 60 knots, with an area of 70 knot winds out of the west just to the south of the Aleutian Islands. So we drop down to 9,000 feet. Circulation around our low near the Alaska Peninsula is giving us some winds out of a southeasterly direction, 25 to 30 knots over southwest Alaska and Kodiak Island. Then becoming more northerly as we move through the southern parts of the Bering Sea and the eastern Aleutians, around 35 knots there. Some stronger winds up to as high as 50 knots out over the Panhandle area out of a southerly direction, and then 35 knots along the coastline as we get just to the east of Prince William Sound. Weaker winds over the remainder of mainland Alaska. Dropping down to 3,000 feet, still with high pressure out over the Arctic coastline, we are expecting weaker winds through much of the northern and central portions of mainland Alaska. Strongest winds are once again going to be over the Panhandle area, southeasterly winds up to as high as 50 knots for the Panhandle, strongest in the southern locations. With our other low pressure system out by the Alaska Peninsula, we are expecting circulation around this low to increase to around 30 to 35 knots out of a southeasterly direction over the Alaska Peninsula near Kodiak Island. And as it becomes northerly out over the Bering, expecting those winds to be 30 to 35 knots over the central and eastern Aleutians. For our turbulence, eastern Aleutians below 3,000 feet is expected, around Bristol Bay below 4,000 feet is expected, and then for all of the Panhandle area below 5,000 feet is expected.
I can't really name anyone that has so much integrity as she does to the things that she's accomplishing. It's pretty amazing. Having Claire as a role model, just a strong woman in science and just so smart and so kind. It's just a huge confidence booster. Is that, hey, I could do that too, you know? That's possible, that's successful, that's what I want to do.
I would characterize her as a pioneer in the field.
The amount and quality of the work she's put out is second to none.
I know people who have a lot of tenacity. I know people that have integrity, but it's rare that people have both together in that, that combination that Claire does.
Every morning, Dr. Claire Parkinson gets up before sunrise and runs 2 miles to work. She hasn't missed a day in nearly 40 years. To know the evolution of sea ice and how we observe it from space is to know Claire. This year, she's celebrating 40 years at NASA.
When I arrived at Goddard, which was in July of 1978, it was an incredibly exciting period here. Satellites were pretty new, but a lot of data had been collected.
NASA scientists were inundated with information, and Claire was in a cohort looking at sea ice, trying to make sense of a jumble of very raw, very new data. It was around that time that Claire and her team, at the time led by Dr. Jays Wally, created the principal sea ice record that we use today. How does something like that record help you do your job?
Oh, that record is fundamental to understanding sea ice. So without it, we wouldn't know how rapidly it's changing.
You may not realize it, but Claire's work studying the changing extent of the ice caps deeply affected our understanding of climate change, and relatedly, our understanding of how climate change affects life on Earth.
One of the clearest signals for climate change that resonates with people has been this shrinking of the polar ice cap in the summer that we're able to see because of Claire's work.
After we had a record that was about 15, 20 years long, we started noticing that the extent of the ice in the Arctic was getting smaller over time.
Sea ice is formed on the surface of the ocean and therefore is made from seawater. The biggest concentration is in the Arctic, and it's also where the biggest loss in sea ice is occurring. Every year, NASA reports on the sea ice minimum and maximum extents. As expected, the data is concerning.
By now, not only has this trend toward lesser ice continued, but it's even accelerated, so that now the decreases are greater than what they had been.
These trends are deeply troubling, but one thing's for sure. Our awareness of shrinking sea ice extent due to climate change was propelled faster and further after Claire Parkinson arrived at NASA.
I mean, she takes her job seriously, and the health and welfare of those instruments in space, yeah, she's on it. You know, it's one of the things you don't worry about because Claire's in the loop on these things. It's going to be fine.
In science, we stand on the shoulders of giants, on the shoulders of those who explored before us. But then, some among us are giants.
For a scientist, it's incredibly exciting to be studying these glaciers and ice sheets right now because they're doing something that hasn't happened in thousands of years. We're watching changes take place that haven't happened since the end of the last ice age. Tuesday was cold, I almost froze my toes. Oh, what's it gonna be next week? Who knows? That's climate. Oh, that's the climate you got. You take a bunch of weather and you average it together and you're doing the climate rock.
At a glacial pace, it means something's happening so slowly you can barely tell it's happening at all. That used to describe the very incremental movement glaciers and ice sheets experienced each year. But now that's changing. We're tagging along with 3 NASA scientists to understand the different lengths they go to not only investigate ice sheets and glaciers, but also communicate their often complicated science to the public. First, let's get oriented. Ice sheets, in pink, pretty much occur in only 2 places, Antarctica and Greenland. Glaciers, in yellow, play a key role draining melt off the ice sheet. Glaciers are also found in the high mountains, but we'll get to those in another episode.
So we know that something's happening in Greenland right now that's unprecedented in the last several thousand years.
That's Dr. Josh Willis, oceanographer at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Josh and his team are tackling one of the major environmental challenges of the 21st century, trying to answer fundamental questions about how melting glaciers impact sea level rise.
With my mission, Oceans Melting Greenland, or OMG for short, we're trying to understand just how much of Greenland's melt is caused by the oceans.
Along with being one of NASA's top scientists working on the cryosphere, Josh is passionate about demystifying climate change in typically unconventional ways.
I think by reaching out to people with a little bit of humor, a little bit of fun, maybe a song, you really have the opportunity to help people understand and come to terms with what we're doing to our planet. Because it's definitely happening and it's definitely a big deal, and we need to start preparing for it.
Down at the opposite pole, Dr. Kelly Brunt is getting ready for a major expedition.
In December and January this coming year, I'll actually be in Antarctica down near the South Pole collecting ground-based GPS data.
This is actually Kelly's second expedition to the South Pole. The first occurred in December and January of last year. Both surveys are critical and will help validate data collected by NASA's airborne campaign, Operation Icebridge, and the recently launched satellite mission ISAT-2.
All three of these layers, that ground-based, that airborne, and the satellite, are all tied together. The ground-based helps validate both the satellite and the airborne helps give us more validation data for the satellites, but also a bigger story with respect to the depth of the ice sheet and what's going on underneath the surface.
While some scientists are taking measurements in the field, others are looking for answers in physics and lines of code.
For me, those projections that we are doing, they do have a very personal meaning.
Dr. Sophie Nowicki is an ice sheet modeler. That means she and her team have the important job of forecasting how ice will change in the future, which also predicts changes in sea level rise. It's a job she doesn't take lightly, especially since urban planning and infrastructure use her team's models to make decisions about the future and safety of their communities.
When we make those projections that are 100 years in the future, 100 years can seem so far away, like I don't have to worry about it, it's just too far. But actually they are not. It's really like the future that we are looking at that our children or grandchildren will see to experience.
Whether it's learning to communicate in new ways, traversing a swath of Antarctica in a massive piston bully, or taking responsibility for an impactful climate forecast, our NASA explorers are pushing the limits of discovery every day. But on a very human level, they're people with families and friends who have a stake in finding out why and how the planet is changing as rapidly as it is.
Every place, at least so far, that we have found life, we found water along with it. And so when we try to understand the thresholds for life, where life might exist elsewhere in our solar system and the universe, water is one of those things that we look for.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section. We'll start off with a look at our ice edge. We do have ice continuing to diminish on that eastern side of St. Lawrence Island, as well as continued diminishment of ice in the Kotzebue Sound area. And we are starting to see signs that there is some degradation to the shore-fast ice along the Arctic coastline from Utqiagvik and areas further to the east, so we are expecting that to start to break away here coming up. As we look at the rest of our marine forecast, starting off in southeast Alaska for Thursday in the inside waters, we have southeast winds 15 to 25 knots, strongest in areas further to the south. Seas in the southern inside waters are also higher at about 9 feet. Out over the Gulf in the southern portions, we're seeing southerly winds 30 knots, becoming westerly winds 25 knots as we move further to the north, and then switching to become more east to northeast as we get up by Gustavus and Yakutat at 15 to 25 knots, weaker as we get closer towards Yakutat. Then on Friday, flow in the northern portions becoming more westerly around 10 knots, then becoming northerly as we get down into eastern locations 15 to 20 knots, highest as we get further to the south. In the inside waters, looking at northerly winds 10 to 20 knots, highest in the areas that are to the south, till we get up further to the north where we are seeing winds switch and become southerly around 15 knots. For south central Alaska, looking at flow in the Gulf of Alaska being primarily out of an easterly direction, 10 to 20 knots, highest as we get further to the north, and then picking up again by the Barren Islands where we are expecting winds to be easterly around 20 knots west of the Barrens. Variable winds around 10 knots for Cook Inlet area, and then northeast 15 knots for Prince William Sound. As we move into Friday, we are looking at winds becoming southwesterly throughout the Gulf. Light winds though around 10 knots, and that's going to be in Prince William Sound as well. And then becoming southerly winds in Cook Inlet area around 15 knots there, and then easterly winds 15 knots moving into Kamishak Bay. For the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island areas on Thursday, we are looking at southeasterly winds becoming easterly for the northern locations, 20 to 25 knots. But circulating around our low pressure system, we are expecting that to become more northerly as we get further to the west around 30 knots, and then becoming northwesterly as we get to the Pacific side of the peninsula around 20 knots there. On Friday, flow still circulating around low pressure for those eastern locations around Kodiak Island. East to southeast winds 15 to 20 knots are expected, seas as high as 6 feet there. Then in northeasterly winds in Bristol Bay area 15 knots, becoming 20 knots as we get further to the west of the Alaska Peninsula, and then northerly winds on the Pacific side of the peninsula around 15 knots there. For the Aleutian chains on Thursday, we're looking at all winds being northwesterly. Most of those locations are going to be 20 to 25 knots. However, as we get more by the western Aleutians, diminishing a little bit to 15 knots there. Seas the highest around 8 feet for areas on the Pacific side of the central and eastern Aleutians. Then on Friday, still going to maintain primarily that northwesterly wind component, but diminishing to 15 to 20 knots. And then by the western Aleutians, down all the way to 10 knots. Seas down as well, up to as high as 6 feet for the eastern Aleutians. For Thursday, along the coastline, or along the west coast, we will see winds out of a southerly direction for the Norton Sound area, 15 knots there. Then becoming northerly along much of the west coast, around 15 knots. Becoming easterly as we get to the southern side of Nunavik Island, 25 knots there. And then by the Pribilof Islands, northerly winds 20 knots is expected. For Friday, most of the flow going to be north to northwest, 15 to 25 knots along the coast as we get by St. Matthew and the Pribilof Islands, dropping down to around 10 knots. And then Norton Sound area, westerly winds around 10 knots is expected. Along the Arctic coastline, northerly winds 5 to 10 knots, and remaining out of the primarily north to northeasterly directions, 15 to 20 knots along the rest of the west coast. Then on Friday, continuing to be north to northeast along the west coast of the state, 20 to 25 knots there, diminishing again along the Arctic coastline, still out of a somewhat northerly direction, but only around 10 knots is expected. Taking a look at the weather for tonight, we will see low pressure out over the central portions of the interior. That will leave some isolated rain showers, expecting those thunderstorms to diminish in the afternoon hours, or in the evening hours rather, with fog along the Arctic coastline, down much of the west coast through St. Lawrence Island area, and down through much of the Bering Sea and central and western Aleutian Islands. Low pressure anchored in by the Alaska Peninsula, bringing rain to the peninsula for the eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, or Kodiak Island, and for southwestern locations of Alaska. South central Alaska, especially along the North Gulf Coast, will see continued rain, and we are expecting rain throughout the Alaska Panhandle. That's going to be reinforced by a low moving in tonight that will bring heavy rain throughout the day tomorrow, expecting rain up to as high as 2 to 3 inches for the southern locations of the Panhandle, especially around areas like Ketchikan. And with Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for being with us tonight.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.